2 Samuel chapter 4, the assassination of Ishbosheth. See if you can say that. Ishbosheth. That's kind of a, can you imagine giving a little boy that name and saying, okay, that's what is your name? And him trying to say Ishbosheth growing up. It'd be really bad once he started losing his teeth, wouldn't it? How would he say that? But that was his name, Ishbosheth. Now, here's the memory verse. It's the last verse of the chapter. David commanded his young men, and they slew them, and cut off their hands and their feet, and hanged them up over the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the sepulchre of Abner in Hebron. Well, that's quite a gruesome verse. That's got to be one of the most gruesome verses in the Bible, I would think, and we'll find out what led to that, just whose hands were hung up and feet and why, as we go on into this story of the assassination of Ishbosheth. Now, I want you to notice how the chapter begins. Verse 1, and. Verse 2, and. Verse 3, and. If you'll flip on back and go to 2 Samuel chapter 3, it'll say now. The first word of that chapter. First word of chapter 2 is and. First word of chapter 1 is now. Go all the way back to 1 Samuel. 1 and 2 Samuel were together. The first word is one of those conjunctions. Go back to the book of Ruth. Same thing. Go back to the book of Judges. Joshua, all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy. And you have these and, now, then, again, conjunctions running all the way through. Now there's no punctuation in the Hebrew. The punctuation is added later. And so you've got all these ands, thens, agains, nows. It's almost as though it's all one long run-on sentence. And when you read the King James Version, you'll pick that up. You may have noticed how they begin all these sentences with a conjunction. And it's part of the Hebrew literary quality. That it takes you and it puts you in the story and it just keeps bringing you on. You know when someone's talking and they'll say and you want to just keep listening to the story. And that's sort of the way the Hebrew language does. And so when the King James translators saw that, they included that right in there. So you got all these conjunctions. It bothers me that a lot of these modern versions, and some of them that say, now we're the most accurate translation, and you turn there and they leave the conjunctions out. They're not there. And what happened to all those conjunctions? And the translator says, oh, well, we didn't need them. And that just bothers me that the Holy Spirit would have filled his writing with all of these conjunctions, and you get somebody that says, oh, we don't need them. It changes the way that it reads when you take them out. It is a little easier to read, and it sounds more like modern writing, but maybe that's why people don't read these modern versions all that much. You know, the most read Bible in the most read English translation is still the King James Version. It's not the most sold, but it is the most read, and it beats out the next two that follow it. You put them together, and there's still not as many as are reading the King James Version. And when people wonder where it got its literary quality, it got it from trying to accurately translate out of the original language. The literary quality is there. They just had to put it in English. And because they didn't make it easy to read, they just took it and tried to transfer what was in those languages into the English language. That literary quality just came right over with it. And I wish that modern translators would realize that and produce modern translations that had the same literary quality as the old translations that did that. But now I'm getting a little off topic. The reason I brought that up is because it gives us a good chance, since it starts with "and." Let's look at what has happened to this point. You remember the story of the Amalekites. Saul was dead, and the Amalekite that came to David, claiming that he is the one that had slain Saul. And then you have David's lament for Saul and Jonathan. And then you have David anointed king in Hebron, and Joab and Abner go to battle. And we realize that then Abner in that battle, he slays Asahel, Joab's brother. So we have a little story about David's 6 wives and 6 sons. But then we read about Abner's ambition and Joab's revenge. And Joab kills Abner. Now remember, Abner was the captain of Saul's army. And when Saul was dead, Abner went to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, and set him up to be king. But Abner was the one that was really running the show. And he was not very respectful to Ishbosheth. And Ishbosheth feared Abner. But he was even more afraid when Abner was dead. 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 1. And when Saul's son heard that Abner was dead in Hebron, his hands were feeble. That tells you he was frightened, wasn't he? He just lost his strength in his hands. Ishbosheth was really not equipped to take on the responsibility of a king. And he knew he depended on Abner's strength to do this, so his hands were feeble. And all of Israel was troubled. They have a man now as king that's not competent to be king. And they are troubled over that. Number 2, verse 2, and Saul's son had 2 men that were captains of bands. Now these armies and the way they lived, kind of like you might think of the Indians on the plains used to do. They'd have bands that go out and raid another village, and they're always taking things from one another. And here he had 2 captains of 2 bands in his army, and they'd go out and raid these Amalekites or Philistines or whoever, and come back with the spoils of that. One was Baana. That's the way I would pronounce his name in my self-pronouncing Bible. Not banana, okay? Baana. Baana was his name. And the other was Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, a Beerothite. Now, that didn't mean they drank a lot of beer. A Beerothite. That means they were from the village of Beeroth. A Beerothite of the children of Benjamin, for Beeroth was also reckoned to Benjamin, and the Beerothites fled to Gittaim and were sojourners there until this day. A sojourner was one who was a stranger in that land, but was allowed to remain there and be there. Now this story goes way back. It goes back to Joshua. And he'd come across the Jordan River and taken Jericho and taken Ai. And then he was defeating king after king. And the Gibeonites came over to see Joshua. And they dressed in old clothes and worn out shoes. And they carried molded bread with them. And the bottles they'd used for their wine and their water, they took old dried up bottles. And they came to Joshua as though they'd come from a far way off and said, Joshua says, you don't need to come attack us. Says, just make a treaty with us and we will serve thee. And Joshua foolishly made that treaty with the Gibeonites. And then to come to find out they were just right over the hill. They'd pulled the trick on him. And so he made them hewers of wood and carriers of water. They became their servants. And Beeroth was among those, the little village of Beeroth was among those Gibeonites that had come to Joshua in doing that. And they let them stay in Benjamin. Now it's a little confusing here to read this. Are these 2 men, Baana and Rechab, are they of the Gibeonites that are just staying there in Benjamin? And that sounds like maybe what they are because of the way it describes this. Or are they of the tribe of Benjamin? And if they are of the tribe of Benjamin itself, then this is some of Ishbosheth kinfolks. You remember that Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. And so would then Ishbosheth be. And it's a little uncertain, but you're kind of wondering, why would they tell you this if these were really of the tribe of Benjamin? And it sounds like these were those that were sojourning in Benjamin, who had come from Beeroth. Now, verse 4. Jonathan, Saul's son. Now, that'd be a rival for the king, wouldn't it? I mean, it was pretty clear that if Saul died, Jonathan was the one that was to be king. Except the fact that Jonathan was going to let David be king. And yet Jonathan, now he's dead, so Abner puts Ishbosheth up there. But what about Jonathan's son? The king line would have really gone on down to Jonathan's son. But now he was disabled. When they found out that Saul and Jonathan were dead, his nurse tried to rescue Mephibosheth, the boy's name, tried to rescue him. He was 5 years old. She was either carrying him or running with him, and he fell and became disabled. He's lame in his feet. He couldn't walk. Well, that would make him unfit to be king. So Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son that was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the tidings came of Saul and Jonathan out of Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it came to pass, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now, we're going to meet up with him later in this story in 2 Samuel. So the fact that he's told here probably is describing why Ishbosheth is king instead of Mephibosheth. But we're going to talk about Mephibosheth later. Not in this chapter, but remember that name. And the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, went and came about the heat of the day to the house of Ishbosheth, who lay in his bed at noon. I told him in class this morning, Ishbosheth, his air conditioner must have gone out. And about the noonday, it starts getting hot. Well, with our air conditioners, we keep going, but it's been a custom in southern regions that when the heat of the day comes, you break off of your labors. It's cool in the mornings. You can get up early in the mornings and work, but long about noon, boy, that sun gets hot. And down in Mexico, they say it's their time for their siesta. And so they rest through the heat of the day, and then after that sun moves on over toward evening, they can get back up and work on into the evening there. And so they have their night rest and their noonday rest. And so it's about the heat of the day, long about noon, and Ishbosheth is getting hot. So to survive the heat, he goes in and he starts taking his afternoon nap. And they came thither into the midst of the house as though they would have fetched wheat. Makes me wonder if maybe Ishbosheth had all the wheat brought to him and then he could sell it back out to the people, kind of a way to raise revenue for the kingdom, you know, the way Pharaoh did in Egypt. Well, they come in to get wheat, and they smote him under the fifth rib. And Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. They assassinated him. They murdered him in his sleep, on his bed. And they escaped. And they must have, what we said, they hightailed it out of there. It says, for when they came into the house, he lay on his bed in his bane chamber, and they smote him and slew him and beheaded him. And they took the head, I bet they put that in their wheat sack. They put the head and got them away through the plain all night. So they got his head and they took off, and they didn't stop all night long. And they're making their way down to David. They brought the head of Ishbosheth unto David in Hebron, and said to the king, behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, thine enemy, which sought thy life. Now they're thinking like the world thinks. The world thinks you love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And they thought, well, Ishbosheth, here he is king up here. David's supposed to be king. Man, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll kill him and take his head to David. Surely David will reward us for slaying the son of Saul, his enemy, and letting him then have the kingdom. But they didn't understand David. And they also said this, and David saw right through this. They said, the Lord hath avenged my Lord the king this day of Saul and of his seed. And David knew that that's not how the Lord works. So here's what David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, and said, as the Lord liveth, who hath redeemed my soul out of all adversity. That's the little part you might want to underline there. David knew that his soul had been redeemed. That is, his life had been spared by the Lord. When he faced the bear, when he faced the lion, when he faced the giant, and when he ran from Saul and was in the midst of the Philistines, and when he fled from him in the wilderness and Saul would come out and almost had him several times and David escaped, he knew the Lord had delivered him out of all his adversity, and David was patient and willing to wait for the Lord to work things out for him to be king on the Lord's own time. And David wasn't rushing things. And so he said, when one told me, saying, behold, Saul is dead, remember that Amalekite? Thinking to have brought good tidings, I took hold of him and slew him in Ziklag, who thought that I would have given him a reward for his tidings. How much more? Now notice how David was so disgusted with this assassination. How much more when wicked men have slain a righteous person in his own house upon his bed? See, there's nothing courageous about that. There's nothing honorable about that. You know, it'd been one thing if they'd called Ishbosheth out and had a good sword fight and a duel and gave him who was it? Used to say, give him a fighting chance. You know, they went in there while he was asleep in his own house on his own bed and slew him in his own bed. Now, David was a killer, but he's not that kind of killer. And he recognizes the difference. And so he said this, shall I not now require his blood of your hand and take you away from the earth? There's something right there you need to know. How's he going to take them away from the earth? He knew what was going to happen when he put them to death. Their bodies would return to the dust from which it came. When he's talking about taking them away from the earth, he's not talking about their bodies. He knows they have a soul. They have a spirit. Upon their death, it departs. It'll go to God who gave it. So they won't be on the earth, will they? David knew that. And he said, I'm going to take you away from the earth. He's talking about severing their soul and their spirit from their body of clay. And so David commanded his young men, the memory verse, and they slew them. And then this is kind of gruesome, isn't it? They cut off their hands and their feet and hang them up over the pool in Hebron. Hebron had a pool. It'd be kind of like your public water works. That's where people would go to get with their pots, and they'd dip it into the pool and take their water home. They'd be the carriers of the water. And now when they come to that pool and look up, look what's hanging over the pool. There's these 4 hands and 4 feet. What are they doing up there? It would let everyone know that David had nothing to do with this assassination of Ishbosheth. And again, you see David is concerned about his integrity and the public perception of that integrity. And the fact that he wanted the people to know, yeah, he'll be king, but he wanted to be king the right way. And he recognized this was not the right way to do it. And so they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the sepulchre of Abner in Hebron. Boy, that is really a bloody chapter. Here's something I want you to do. Here, I got a little bit. We're going to start going into review, and I won't be here then for these reviews. But here's what, Georgia, you and Lillian and anybody else, here's what you can do to kind of help review this. Think about the places we've discussed so far in these first chapters. I've got a list of the places: Ziklag, Mount Gilboa, Gath, Ashkelon, Hebron, Jezreel, Carmel, Jabesh, Gilead. What happened in those places? Or why are those places named? And so here's what you might do. Take your little notebook, read the first 4 chapters, write down all the places, and see if you can remember why that place was mentioned, and that'll help you remember the whole story then by studying the places. Here's something else you can do. Here's David's wives. His 6 wives, and then Michal, that was really his first wife, but I've got her listed 7 because he comes 7th here in this story here. And the sons of those wives. Now I want you to note the name Absalom. We'll come across Absalom again. And he was the grandson of Talmai. And see, Talmai was a king. And so Absalom, he thought he ought to be king too, as we'll see. Now, and then we got Michal, her husband, Phaltiel, and Laish, then his father, and how Saul had taken Michal away from David and given her to this man, and David said, I'll talk to you, but you got to give Michal back. And so now David's in Hebron with 7 wives. I tell you, that's asking for trouble. And trouble comes as a result of this. All right. And then the other people mentioned in the story. Another thing, write down names of all the people come across. And see, why are they in this story? And if you can go through these names, it says, okay, I know what part they played in this story of David, Saul, David, Jonathan, Abner, Ner. Did you see Ner, Abner, and Ner? Abner, the son of Ner. Can't quite remember that. Ishbosheth, Joab, Abishai, Asahel. They were the sons of Zariah. Rizpah, the concubine, and her father, Ahah, Anna, Rechab, Rimmon, and Mephibosheth. These are the names we've had. Go through the Bible, and if you can explain the places, and if you can explain the names, it'll really help secure the whole story to you there. So that's something you can do maybe by way of review when you get there. Well, David lived in very treacherous times, didn't he? And David, boy, he could be gruesome in what he did in seeking after justice, but he saw the difference in a righteous way, in a righteous taking of a life, and an unrighteous taking of a life. He wanted to hold his integrity and hold it up to public view. Now, we don't want to just have integrity just before the public. We really want to be men and women of integrity. And the public will know that if we do. If we are not, it'll reflect on the others of us in this church. Because they'll say, well, they go to church there and they do that, and it's not just for the rest of us. But we want to be people of integrity. We want to do that, one, for our own honor, but particularly, we want to honor our God and let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify us. No, that they may see our good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. So let's learn from David in these lessons the importance of public integrity. Now I also want to offer an invitation for those that need the forgiveness of sins. If you're not a member of the church, you need to be baptized into Christ. And if you are, you can confess your faults one to another, and we will pray that the sins may be forgiven. And if you need to respond to that invitation, then do it while we stand and sing.